So it's the end of December, the beginning of January 2016, and it's time for me to review the December 2015 Smithsonian issue. I was going to do this in the last week of December, but I got distracted by family gatherings over the holidays. You know how that goes. Anyway, on to the magazine. The first small article is a little about Rosa Parks, pointing out that, to quote, far from being a meek seamstress who just happened to defy authorities that December evening, the evening they mean when she refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white person, she was a fierce and persistent political activist nearly her whole life. The pages speak of a collection of Rosa Parks' personal papers that talk about her beliefs and the struggles her family went through. The archives were purchased by the Howard G. Buffett Foundation and lent to the Library of Congress for 10 years, presumably beginning now. Now, Rosa Parks' story is a common lesson for school children on race relations, but this history of hers of activism really isn't made part of that lesson very often. It's an intriguing story. The page called Wasteland, which is barely only 2 pages long, paragraphs long, talks about trash buildup in oceans and on land, which is a significant ecological problem. I have seen footage of places on land and at the bottom of the ocean and floating on the ocean that is just filled with trash. I have to say, as an ecologist, I thought there'd be more about that in this article, and it's something that needs addressing all over the world. There's a little bit about an MRI image of a mother and child, and then there's Quakers with a Vengeance. This article talks about the history of Nantucket Island, a crescent-shaped sandbar island that, in the second half of the 1700s, became a massive whaling port after the bloating livestock population had turned the inland part of the island, almost too arid for farming, overfarmed and overgrazed. The settlers turned to the sea and the whales for their living. See how changes in the environment in one area can affect what happens in another? Now, for a moment, let's talk about the ecological issues with whaling. Whales are large animals who have very few offspring and over long time periods. Offspring are few and far between. Any large-scale culling of animals like that is going to mean it is very easy to drive them to extinction. And once you've done that, you've removed both your resource and an important piece of the food web. Before humans, large whales really only had 2 major predators in recent geological times. Well, 3 maybe. The megalodon shark, which went extinct a few million years ago, maybe as recently as only 2 million years ago. Possibly the Leviathan sperm whale, also extinct. And their niche was succeeded by the modern orca, or killer whale pods. So, quoting from the article, every autumn, hundreds of right whales converged to the south of the island and remained until early spring. So Nantucket Island was right on the coast of the right whale's migration path. And the Wampanoag whales, the Wampanoag Native American tribe would have been very familiar with the whale's migration. And from them, the white settlers learned this as well. In the early 1800s, after the American Revolution and the War of 1812, conflicts in which British ships had been attacking American vessels, the whaling business suffered. Then after the resurgence of whaling and the trend in hunting sperm whales in the Pacific rather than the right whales, because the sperm whales, while more aggressive and more difficult to hunt and rarer, would fetch a larger prize and superior oil. What happened is that whaling voyages started taking years instead of weeks or months. It's an interesting history of causes and consequences, and in the last pages, it talks about certain similarities that arose between the sperm whales and the community of Nantucket itself. Next, there's a couple of pages about mockumentaries and how much fakes and made-up things are in them, and in stories made about people's lives. It's not much more than that, and honestly, this one didn't really interest me. Out of This World is the next article, and it's about the New Horizons images of Pluto. I will be making a separate video talking about that mission, so I won't go into the article much, and it doesn't really say all that much anyway, but it does detail the lengths that one of the scientists, Alan Stern, went to get the New Horizons project up and running. The next one, titled Comic Book Hero, says that schools are beginning to recognize comic books as actual literary works. About time. Apparently there was a Senate subcommittee investigation in 1954 that linked juvenile delinquency to horror and crime comics. I did a tiny bit of research on this, and the senators focused on particularly crime and horror stories at the time, especially a certain crime suspense stories, number 22, which featured a killer holding a decapitated woman's head along with an axe. They argued that children are hurt or damaged by things like this, and that can lead them to delinquency and even crime. Now, this illustration had in fact already been cleaned up, so that there was no longer blood dripping from the mouth, and the blood on the axe was black instead of red. Honestly, looking at them, the picture changes don't seem that different to me. And when you're trying to link things like comics and literature to crime and delinquency, it's a very uncertain link with 1,000 other probable factors, and sometimes it seems like people pick the easy thing to point at rather than try and truly look at what societal conditions are doing as a whole. That aside, the article comes with a short comic about the very issue of using comics to open up kids to reading. My little brother is not a very big reader of books, but he loves comics, so I find a lot of validity in that. Comics are very much real art and literature, and despite not being much of a comic reader myself, my younger brother and I are almost polar opposites in this. I'm a huge bookworm. I do greatly admire him. Face to Face is an article about a scientist named Rana of Kelby who studies facial expressions and emotions, and there's talk of programming technology to respond to human emotions through clues in the face. It's interesting, but I don't really know how I feel about it. I tend to think humans should be the ones interpreting humans, flawed as the interpretations often are. Technology doing it is just a little creepy, and I don't know. The Maestro is about a lyricist, composer, and performer named Lin-Manuel Miranda, who has a stage performance called Hamilton, which is a story of the life of Alexander Hamilton, one of the main builders of what America came to be. His story and Miranda's are both interesting, and this play definitely looks worth going to see. There's a couple of shorter articles, one about a girl named Liliana Zyskowski, who invents miniature monitors for various things that speak to a person's social account. social media account, and one about a man named Theaster Gates, who is a sculptor and builder, among other things. There is some detail in these, not that much. Snap Judgment is a page about a mousetrap patented in 1894 and a few pictures of archaic designs. Okay. If you want the best mousetrap that ever existed, get a kitty. A kitty cat is better than any human contraption, hands down. I had a little girl kitty who, sadly, she died from sudden seizures a couple of years ago, but she was a master mouse catcher. Her name was Blueberry, and she was a little tuxedo kitty. You can see a photograph of her in my Berry Twins in Nageki no Mori video. There's a little bit about artists who are making new billboards, some of which are quite pretty. Then there's an article about the growing and studying of nerve cells to study Alzheimer's disease, which takes reading a few times over to really get. I am an ecologist and paleontologist, so this is not my branch of science. Added to the fact that I've had decades of really bad experiences with medicine, so this is not the easiest thing for me to read. But suffice to say, the article is about the study of the degradation of human brain cells grown in gel in the lab. They compare the brain's consistency to that of a gel. And there's the study of the genetics related to Alzheimer's. What seems to take place is that in the presence of certain genetic mutations, some of which also link to Down syndrome, mutations prevent excess buildup of amyloid beta protein from being recycled. This is a protein which is usually used to protect the brain cells against infections. But once it's been used, it is a hindrance to the brain to keep it around. So normally it would get decomposed or recycled, and this is a mutation that prevents that. This means the buildup continues and eventually destroys the brain cells, which actually makes it sound very similar to a cancer. I don't know if that's surprising or not. If this turns out to indeed be a major source of Alzheimer's disease, then what treatments would have to target is restoring the brain's ability to break down and recycle this protein. Complex, but certainly possible. And that's it. The remaining pages are just ads and offers. I hope you'll return when I talk about the January-February issue of Smithsonian. It looks like they're covering both months in one magazine. One issue. Okay, well, till then.